The history of ancient China matters today because people make it matter. It's a remarkable fact that even a political leader as iconoclastic and obsessed with modernization as Mao Zedong under communism was at the same time obsessed with the reinterpretation of the history of Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the emperor whom we call in English the first emperor in the history of China. Is anyone in Germany today sincerely interested in reinterpreting the history of Emperor Charlemagne, their ancient king, in the same way? Does anyone in Germany feel that the understanding of that history has real significance for what Germany is today, how it is governed today, the legitimacy of the leaders, the legitimacy of the political system today, and for what Germany ought to be in the future? I think nobody feels that way. In England, does anyone in England look back on the career of King Arthur the same way that Mao Zedong, and really that whole generation of the Communist Party, obsessively looked back to the first emperor of China? Does anyone in England care in the least about any of their ancient kings and feel that it has this powerful political significance now and for the future of England? I would say, in my humble opinion, nobody feels that way. Maybe there are some aristocrats. Maybe there are some people in England I haven't met. Maybe there are some people living at a higher socioeconomic status who grow up with a very different view of history. But no, in mainstream politics, nobody in England feels that way. Definitely in left-wing politics. Definitely in communist politics in England. Nobody feels that way. It's really a bad start for educators, high school teachers or university professors, to try to dazzle the students with the ancientness of ancient China. What's impressive about ancient China is not how ancient it is. It's the extent to which it still really matters today, that it's still really meaningful and powerful in politics, that it's still a part of state ideology in China today. Ancient China is not all that ancient. Not compared to Egypt. Ancient Egypt is more ancient and more impressive. The pyramids, the art of ancient Egypt, even if you just go to Paris and see what the French stole from Egypt, it's mind-blowing. It's very, very impressive. Okay? However, for political identity in Egypt today, political ideology in Egypt today, they have a huge cultural discontinuity caused by Islam. There is no sense in which the history or political philosophy of the ancient rulers of Egypt matters for modern Egypt today in the way that ancient China matters for modern China today. I can name two more countries that really have a more ancient history than China, and the Chinese are very reluctant to admit this when you talk about this with them face to face. You ever heard of India? India is ancient too, and we have written records going back to an unbelievably long way in the history of India. You ever heard of a little country called Iraq? Iraq probably holds the record for the most ancient civilization in terms of human beings living in urban populations, living in cities. And we have written records going back a long, long way. Unbelievably ancient in Iraq. However, debates about ancient Iraq, pre-modern, pre-Muslim Iraq, do those matter in Iraq today? The way that the formation of state ideology in China still matters in China today, even within the Communist Party, even for a unique historical figure like Mao Zedong. That is what's remarkable. So let's begin this video with a summary instead of ending with a summary. You have the ancient, fabled period of kingship that we mostly know about from a book that may hold the record as the most ancient book or the most ancient extant, writing of any length in the history of Chinese civilization, which is memorably titled The Book, the Shu Jing. So in English, this is often called something like the Book of Documents. Shujing, so it's the same way that in English, Bible is ultimately just a word that meant book. Shujing is an unbelievably non-specific title. This is an ancient description of how the kingdom worked, a lot of platitudes about what it is to be a good king, what it is to be a good ruler, but it includes some platitudes and some descriptions of how trials worked, how the justice system worked. We do get some valuable historical evidence, but it's an incredibly boring book. Nobody is saying philosophically that the question of how China should be ruled today is based on this early, more fabled period. So moving forward, you have this period of fables. You then move forward into the Warring States period. And the Warring States period only has that name because later on, people look back on it and call it the Warring States period. If we're discussing the history of Western Europe, the whole history is the Warring States period, right? Like, what are you going to say? The Napoleonic period was the Warring States period. Before and after, it was also divided into Warring States. The Warring States period, it's only given this name when the Han Dynasty is looking back and contrasting it to the emergent new idea that China naturally, under the mandate of heaven, ought to be organized around the rule of a single emperor. A single man ought to unify the whole of China. There's a considerable footnote here that the borders defining the whole of China changed from period to period. Warring States period, we move forward into the short-lived Qin dynasty. Okay, this is, I'm not really pronouncing it correctly. This is Qin with a Q. Qin. The Qin dynasty, QIN, has one philosopher in the middle of it called Lord Shang. Lord Shang is now in English described as a legalist. All these categories are pretty meaningless. And here we have a shocking contrast to the idealism of that earlier period of fabled monarchs, fabled rule. We now have a very brutal, very Machiavellian, very pragmatic philosophy of state that is written by real people talking about real situations. This is like the contrast between, King Arthur and reading Aristotle's down-to-earth analysis of how government actually works. This isn't a fable. This isn't a fable like King Arthur. This is moving forward where suddenly we get a perspective on history and politics, and which includes how to organize farming, how to organize the army, of course, but how to organize all of society. We have a coherent philosophy from the middle of the Qin dynasty, I should say really just the Qin kingdom. And then as history progresses, Qin conquers more and more of its neighbors, and it reaches the apex of megalomania under the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. So Qin Shi Huang is remembered as the first emperor. As you can already tell from what I've just said, there were other kings before him. There were other people who could be described as emperors. He actually creates a new term in Chinese, meaning emperor. He is remembered as the first emperor. And he is remembered for unifying China. He didn't unify all of China under its current borders, but nevertheless, what you then have after the collapse of the Qin dynasty, after the end of the Qin dynasty, you have the Han dynasty. And the Han dynasty looks back on this history. And it's in that period that for the first time you have in written Chinese the Warring States period, called such, the period of Warring States, followed by the period of unification under the Qin. And you have the analysis of the Qin as being effective but evil. And then the resolution that as Chinese history moves forward, under the Han dynasty and the dynasties that followed, that China was going to be effective but good. So the critique of what was wrong with the Qin dynasty, the writing of history to make Qin Shi Huang a villain rather than a hero when he unified China, that's the formation of Chinese state ideology. Now, that's not the whole story. We could make a separate video about Chinese philosophy of education. The crucial role that education had in really cementing this into ancient China as we know it today. When we look back, we tend to remember this more ancient period as if they already had the system of exams, written examinations that defined who was a bureaucrat, who was a scholar, who participated in the system of government. Nothing like that existed in this period. But that is a later development that's very important to the idea of legitimacy. And that still exists in China today. I did a recent video that was called China Does Not Pretend to Be a Democracy. And they still set this out. They still talk about what's crucial to the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese government today, is they talk a lot about written exams. That in order to be a powerful or influential person, in order to participate in government in China today, they talk about how many exams these people have to write, that they have to study and write exams, and that qualifies them to participate in government. This is a contrast to the United States of America. I don't know if Donald Trump wrote a single exam in his life. And of course, anyone can be elected to be mayor, senator, what have you. In most Western systems of government, there is no examination that defines your legitimacy. But apart from your legitimacy as a particular politician, the whole system of government is legitimized by participating in this system of hierarchical education. And that idea that the exams emanate from the emperor, and at the same time they then confer legitimacy on the government of the emperor, that is a later development in Chinese state ideology. In this early period, with the emergence of the Han Dynasty, you have a much simpler, linear development. There was the earlier period of kind of fables, the Warring States period, the emergence of the Qin, and again, the philosophy of the Qin, the political philosophy of the Qin, we have neatly summed up in this one remarkable short document, the Book of Lord Shang. And then we have the rejection of that, the repudiation of that, the critique of that by Han, the Han Dynasty, and then the conditions of the state, the idea of what it is to have a good government that endures from the Han Dynasty forward for a very long time. That really creates the foundation on which Buddhism flourishes, on which Confucianism flourishes, on which Taoism flourishes. I think if we're being honest about the formation of Chinese state ideology, with the Book of Lord Shang, and then the critique of the Book of Lord Shang, the rise and fall of the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, I think it's fair to say that Buddhism is of almost zero importance here. And I think even Taoism and Confucianism, narrowly defined. Sometimes people use the word Confucianism just to mean all traditional Chinese culture, but narrowly defining it, I think that Confucianism is very important to the later period, the Han Dynasty forward, their ideas of legitimacy and good government and what it is to be a good man and a good civil servant and so on. But I think it's very important to note that when we're talking about Qin Shi Huang, Lord Shang, even the Han Feizi, Han Fei, another early legalist, even the original writing of the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu, I think in that period, we're not really talking about Confucianism as a major player in formation of Chinese state ideology yet. Okay, this comes later. Okay, so what really matters about ancient China is that nobody will leave this alone. Is that a figure, even a figure as iconoclastic and modernizing as Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong had the slogan, "Smash the old society." Mao Zedong went out and called for the Buddhist temples to be burned down and destroyed, burned the old books. He led a period of kind of unbelievable hostility towards tradition in ancient China. But he personally, we know this already as I think not even a high school student, like a middle school student, he read and studied the philosophy of Lord Shang, Lord Shang's idea of government and the state. So we know this, at least as a high school kid, he knew about this and cared about this. And right up to his death as an old man, he's looking back at this history and he's participating in these debates. And by the way, when I say participate in these debates, it wasn't merely academic. People got persecuted, people got tortured, people got beaten up, people got killed over these debates about reinterpreting Chinese history. Looking back and reinterpreting. And he was especially interested in looking at that first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, and saying, wait, was he really the villain of history? Or should we consider him the hero, with an awareness that the later history that was written after his regime collapsed history was written by the victors, the subsequent victors, shouldn't we look back and see that this is kind of propaganda, and that maybe the archaeological evidence and maybe reinterpreting the textual evidence we had would instead show Qin Shi Huang to be the hero? There is no doubt that Mao Zedong thought of himself as a figure in history like Qin Shi Huang. There is a quotation from him that's now infamous, I think because of the work of Frank Decoder, a modern historian in English, where Mao Zedong boasted that he had killed an enormous number of intellectuals, that he had burned an enormous number of books, that academics remembered Qin Shi Huang as a villain for only murdering so many thousand scholars, only burning so many thousand books, but that he, Mao Zedong, had killed so many more people and burned so many more books. So therefore, was he a greater man or was he a worse man? The attempts of Mao Zedong to compare himself to that imperial past, including there's this never-ending controversy during the Cultural Revolution of going back. There's a particular opera made about bringing a complaint to the emperor, and the emperor then, punishing the guy who dares to complain. There's, even the reinterpretation of the water margin during that period. But going back and reinterpreting this core formation of state ideology in China, looking at the significance of the first emperor, the significance of that so-called legalist philosophy, especially the one short book, the Book of Lord Shan. There's much less interest in the Han Feizi, for whatever reason, which is a much longer book. And reconsidering this, what does it mean to be Chinese? What is legitimacy in government? Why is it, quote unquote, the mandate of heaven that all of China should be unified under the rule of one man? These incredibly simple, brutal ideas, those have retained currency and gravity and weight. They're still connected to the idea of what it means to be Chinese, of what it means for a given government to be the legitimate ruler of China. And of course, I guess part of the magic these ancient texts have is just that China never had the sort of radical discontinuity in its history created by Egypt converting to Islam. It's very difficult to imagine. What if Egyptians today still worshipped the same gods and goddesses that were worshipped in ancient pharaonic Egypt? What if it was still Osiris and Isis, the various gods with animal heads? What if that still was the predominant culture in Egypt, albeit that it had evolved through various permutations, various adaptations as the centuries go by, as happens in every culture? I mean, Catholicism today is not entirely continuous with Catholicism 1,000 years ago. There are discontinuities within that. Can we imagine a world in which there was greater cultural continuity in Egypt, and in which people really cared about not just the symbolic, but the narrative and legal basis for the legitimacy of the rule of pharaohs in ancient Egypt, where some of that, carried forward and was still part of the debate today? I think, it reflects both the weakness and the strength of Chinese culture. The weakness of being one of the last countries to have no claim to democracy, just refusing the whole idea that government is by the people and for the people. They cling to these ideas that education and writing the exams confers legitimacy. They cling to these ideas that their ancient history, their connection to Qin Shi Huang and the Han Dynasty and the unity of the Chinese people and the mandate under heaven and the greatness and glory of these ancient texts and ancient monuments and art and archaeology of ancient China. They cling to this in a way that modern Italy does not cling to ancient Rome. Why is one person the leader of Italy and not another? Well, because you voted for him. It's kind of simple. Doesn't mean they have no interest in ancient Rome. They have some interest. But, there isn't this powerful sense that the legitimacy and ideology of the ruler of Italy today must connect to the philosophy of Cicero from, ancient Rome, the fall of the Roman Republic, rise of the empire, and that stuff. That history, I'm really being sincere when I say this, I really think that history does not matter to Italy as passionately and powerfully as the history of the first emperor in China still matters to the Communist Party in China today and still matters to Chinese people today, not just the intellectual elite. I think the working class, the middle class, people of average education, people who just finished high school and went into the workforce, believe it or not, sincerely, I still think this political history matters today. The formation of Chinese state ideology has an uncanny continuity that survived the rise and fall of Mao Zedong's communism.